The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 1, by Will Durant, concluded. The age produced two geographers of universal medieval renown. Abu Abdallah Muhammad al-Idrisi was born at Ceuta in 1100, studied at Cordova, and wrote in Palermo, at the behest of King Roger II of Sicily, his Kitab al-Rujari, or Roger's Book. It divided the earth into 7 climatic zones, and each zone into 10 parts. Each of the 70 parts was illustrated by a detailed map. These maps were the crowning achievement of medieval cartography, unprecedented in fullness, accuracy, and scope. Al-Idrisi, like most Muslim scientists, took for granted the sphericity of the earth. Rivaling him for the honor of being the greatest medieval geographer was Abu Abdallah Yaqut, who lived from 1179 to 1229. Born a Greek in Asia Minor, he was captured in war and enslaved. But the Baghdad merchant who bought him gave him a good education and then freed him. He traveled much, first as a merchant, then as a geographer, fascinated by places and their diverse populations, dress, and ways. He rejoiced to find 10 libraries at Merv, one containing 12,000 volumes. The discriminating curators allowed him to take as many as 200 volumes at a time to his room. Those who have loved books as the lifeblood of great men will sense the dusty joy he felt in these treasures of the mind. He moved on to Khiva and Balkh. There the Mongols almost caught him in their murderous advance. He fled, naked but clutching his manuscripts, across Persia to Mosul. While buttering the bread of poverty as a copyist, he completed his Mujam al-Budan of 1228, a vast geographical encyclopedia which summed up nearly all medieval knowledge of the globe. Yaqut included almost everything: astronomy, physics, archaeology, ethnography, history, giving the coordinates of cities, and the lives and works of their famous men. Seldom has any man so loved the earth. Botany, almost forgotten since Theophrastus, revived with the Moslems of this age. Al-Idrisi wrote a herbal, but stressed the botanical rather than merely the medicinal interest of 360 plants. Abul Abbas of Seville in 1216 earned the surname of Al-Nabati, the botanist, by his studies of plant life from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Abu Muhammad ibn Baitar of Malaga, from 1190 to 1248, gathered all Islamic botany into a vast work of extraordinary erudition, which remained the standard botanical authority till the 16th century, and marked him as the greatest botanist and pharmacist of the Middle Ages. Ibn Alawan of Seville, in 1190, won a like preeminence in agronomy. His Kitab al-Falahah, Book of the Peasant, analyzed soils and manures, described the cultivation of 585 plants and 50 fruit trees, explained methods of grafting, and discussed the symptoms and cures of plant diseases. This was the most complete treatment of agricultural science in the whole medieval period. In this, as in the preceding age, the Moslems produced the leading physicians of Asia, Africa, and Europe. They excelled especially in ophthalmology, perhaps because eye diseases were so prevalent in the Near East. There, as elsewhere, medicine was paid most to cure, least to prevent. Operations for cataract were numerous. Khalifa ibn Abil Mahasin of Aleppo in 1256 was so confident of his skill that he operated for cataract on a one-eyed man. Ibn Baitar's Kitab al-Jami made medicinal botanical history. It listed 1,400 plants, foods, and drugs, 300 of them new, analyzed their chemical constitution and healing power, and added acute observations on their use in therapy. But the greatest name in this acme of Moslem medicine is Abu Marwan ibn Zur, who lived from 1091 to 1162, of Seville, known to the European medical world as Avenzoar. He was the third in 6 generations of famous physicians, all of one family line, and each at the top of his profession. His Kitab al-Tasir, or Book of Simplification on Therapeutics and Diet, was written at the request of his friend Averroes, who, himself the greatest philosopher of the age, considered him the greatest physician since Galen. Ibn Zur's forte was clinical description. He left classical analyses of mediastinal tumors, pericarditis, intestinal tuberculosis, and pharyngeal paralysis. Translations of the Tasir into Hebrew and Latin deeply influenced European medicine. Islam led the world also in the equipment and competence of its hospitals. One founded by Nuruddin at Damascus in 1160 gave free treatment and drugs during 3 centuries. For 267 years, we are told, its fires were never extinguished. Ibn Jubayr, coming to Baghdad in 1184, marveled at the great Bimaristan-Adadi, a hospital rising like some royal palace along the banks of the Tigris. Here food and drugs were given to the patients without charge. In Cairo, in 1285, Sultan Kalaun began the Maristan al-Mansur, the greatest hospital of the Middle Ages. Within a spacious quadrangular enclosure, 4 buildings rose around a courtyard adorned with arcades and cooled with fountains and brooks. There were separate wards for diverse diseases and for convalescents, laboratories, a dispensary, outpatient clinics, diet kitchens, baths, a library, a chapel, a lecture hall, and particularly pleasant accommodations for the insane. Treatment was given gratis to men and women, rich and poor, slave and free, and a sum of money was disbursed to each convalescent on his departure so that he need not at once return to work. The sleepless were provided with soft music, professional storytellers, and perhaps books of history. Asylums for the care of the insane existed in all the major cities of Islam. 7. Al-Ghazali and the Religious Revival. Amid these advances of science, the old orthodoxy fought to keep the loyalty of the educated classes. The conflict between religion and science led many to skepticism, some to open atheism. Al-Ghazali divided Muslim thinkers into 3 groups: theists, deists or naturalists, and materialists, and denounced all 3 groups alike as infidels. The theists accepted God and immortality, but denied creation and the resurrection of the body, and called heaven and hell spiritual conditions only. The deists acknowledged a deity, but rejected immortality and viewed the world as a self-operating machine. The materialists completely rejected the idea of God. A semi-organized movement, the Dariyah, professed a frank agnosticism. Several of these doubting Thomases lost their heads to the executioner. "You torment yourself for nothing," said Ispahan ibn Kara to a pious faster during Ramadan. "Man is like a seed of grain that sprouts and grows up and is then mowed down to perish forever. Eat and drink." It was in reaction against such skepticism that Mohammedanism produced its greatest theologian, the Augustine and the Kant of Islam. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali was born at Tus in 1058, lost his father early, and was reared by a Sufi friend. He studied law, theology, and philosophy. At 33, he was appointed to the chair of law at the Nizamiya College in Baghdad. Soon all Islam acclaimed his eloquence, erudition, and dialectical skill. After 4 years of this glory, he was laid low by a mysterious disease. Appetite and digestion failed, paralysis of the tongue occasionally distorted his speech, and his mind began to break down. A wise physician diagnosed his case as mental in origin. In truth, as Al-Ghazali later confessed in his remarkable autobiography, he had lost belief in the capacity of reason to sanction the Mohammedan faith, and the hypocrisy of his orthodox teaching had become unbearable. In 1094 he left Baghdad, ostensibly on a pilgrimage to Mecca. Actually, he went into seclusion, seeking silence, contemplation, and peace. Unable to find in science the support he sought for his crumbling faith, he turned from the outer to the internal world. There he thought he found a direct and immaterial reality, which offered a firm basis for belief in a spiritual universe. He subjected sensation, on which materialism seemed to rest, to critical scrutiny, accused the senses of making the stars appear small when, to be so visible from afar, they must be vastly larger than the earth, and concluded from 100 such examples that sensation by itself could be no certain test of truth. Reason was higher, and corrected one sense with another, but in the end it too rested on sensation. Perhaps there was in man a form of knowledge, a guide to truth surer than reason. Al-Ghazali felt that he had found this in the introspective meditation of the mystic. The Sufi came closer than the philosopher to the hidden core of reality. The highest knowledge lay in gazing upon the miracle of mind until God appeared within the self, and the self itself disappeared in the vision of an all-absorbing one. In this mood, Al-Ghazali wrote his most influential book, Tahafut al-Filasifa, The Destruction of Philosophy. All the arts of reason were turned against reason. By a transcendental dialectic as subtle as Kant's, the Muslim mystic argued that reason leads to universal doubt, intellectual bankruptcy, moral deterioration, and social collapse. 7 centuries before Hume, Al-Ghazali reduced reason to the principle of causality, and causality to mere sequence. All that we perceive is that B regularly follows A, not that A causes B. Philosophy, logic, science cannot prove the existence of God or the immortality of the soul. Only direct intuition can assure us of these beliefs, without which no moral order and therefore no civilization can survive. In the end, Al-Ghazali returned through mysticism to all orthodox views. The old fears and hopes of his youth flowed back upon him, and he professed to feel the eyes and threats of a stern deity close over his head. He proclaimed anew the horrors of the Mohammedan hell, and urged their preaching as necessary to popular morality. He accepted again the Koran and the Hadith. In his Iya Ulum al-Din, Revival of the Science of Religion, he expounded and defended his renovated orthodoxy with all the eloquence and fervor of his prime. Never in Islam had the skeptics and the philosophers encountered so vigorous a foe. When he died in 1111, the tide of unbelief had been effectually turned. All orthodoxy took comfort from him. Even Christian theologians were glad to find, in his translated works, such a defense of religion and such an exposition of piety as no one had written since Augustine. After him, and despite Averroes, philosophy hid itself in the remote corners of the Moslem world. The pursuit of science waned, and the mind of Islam more and more buried itself in the Hadith and the Koran. The conversion of Al-Ghazali to mysticism was a great victory for Sufism. Orthodoxy now accepted Sufism, which for a time engulfed theology. The mullahs, learned exponents of Moslem doctrine and law, still dominated the official religious and legal world, but the field of religious thought was yielded to Sufi monks and saints. Strangely contemporary with the rise of the Franciscans in Christendom, a new monasticism took form in 12th century Islam. Sufi devotees now abandoned family life, lived in religious fraternities under a sheikh or master, and called themselves dervish or fakir, a Persian and an Arabic word for poor man or mendicant. Some by prayer and meditation, some by ascetic self-denial, others in the exhaustion that followed wild dancing, sought to transcend the self and rise to a wonder-working unity with God. Their doctrine received formulation in the 150 books of Muhyi al-Din ibn al-Arabi, who lived from 1165 to 1240, a Spanish Moslem domiciled in Damascus. The world was never created, said al-Arabi, for it is the external aspect of that which in inward view is God. History is the development of God to self-consciousness, which he achieves at last in man. Hell is temporary. In the end, all will be saved. Love is mistaken when it loves a physical and transitory form. It is God who appears in the beloved, and the true lover will find and love the author of all beauty in any beautiful form. Perhaps recalling some Christians of Jerome's time, Al-Arabi taught that he who loves and remains chaste until death dies a martyr, and achieves the highest reach of devotion. Many married dervishes profess to live in such chastity with their wives. Through the gifts of the people, some Moslem religious orders became wealthy and consented to enjoy life. Formerly, complained a Syrian sheikh about 1250, the Sufis were a fraternity dispersed in the flesh but united in the spirit. Now they are a body well clothed carnally and ragged in divine mystery. The populace smiled tolerantly at these sacred worldlings, but lavished worship upon sincere devotees, ascribed to them miraculous deeds and powers, honored them as saints, celebrated their birthdays, prayed for their intercession with Allah, and made pilgrimages to their tombs. Mohammedanism, like Christianity, was a developing and adjustable religion which would have startled a reborn Muhammad or Christ. As orthodoxy triumphed, toleration waned. From Harun al-Rashid on, the so-called Ordinance of Omar, formerly ignored, was increasingly observed. Theoretically, though not always in practice, non-Muslims were now required to wear distinguishing yellow stripes on their clothing. They were forbidden to ride on horseback, but might use an ass or a mule. They were not to build new churches or synagogues, but might repair old ones. No cross was to be displayed outside a church, no church bell should ring. Non-Muslim children were not to be admitted to Muslim schools, but could have schools of their own. This is still the letter of the law, not always enforced in Islam. Nevertheless, there were 45,000 Christians in 10th century Baghdad. Christian funeral processions passed unharmed through the streets, and Muslim protests continued against the employment of Christians and Jews in high office. Even in the heat and challenge of the Crusades, Saladin could be generous to the Christians in his realm. 8. Averroes. For a time, philosophy survived in Moslem Spain by judiciously sprinkling professions of orthodoxy among the timid tentatives of critique, and thought found a precarious freedom in the courts of rulers who enjoyed in private the speculations that they accounted harmful to the populace. So the Almoravid governor of Saragossa chose as his minister and friend Abu Bekr ibn Bajjah, who had been born there about 1106. Avampace, as Europe would call him, had reached even in youth an extraordinary proficiency in science, medicine, philosophy, music, and poetry. Ibn Khaldun tells how the governor so admired some verses of the young scholar that he vowed the poet should always walk on gold when entering his presence. whereupon Ibn Bajjah, lest this vow should abate his welcome, put a gold coin in each of his shoes. When Saragossa fell to the Christians, the poet-scientist-minister fled to Fez, where he found himself destitute among Moslems who accused him of atheism. He died at the age of 30, allegedly by poison. His lost treatise on music was accounted the masterpiece on that subtle subject in the literature of Western Islam. His most famous work, A Guide to the Solitary, renewed a basic theme of Arabic philosophy. The human intellect, said Ibn Bajjah, is composed of two parts: the material intellect, which is bound up with the body and dies with it, and the active intellect, or impersonal cosmic mind, which enters into all men and is alone immortal. Thought is man's highest function. By thought, rather than by mystic ecstasy, man can attain to knowledge of and union with the active intellect or God. But thinking is a perilous enterprise, except in silence. The wise man will live in quiet seclusion, shunning doctors, lawyers, and the people. Or perhaps a few philosophers will form a community where they may pursue knowledge in tolerant companionship far from the maddened crowd. Abu Bakr ibn Tufail, Europe's Abu Basir, who lived possibly from 1107 to 1185, continued the ideas of Ibn Bajjah and almost realized his ideals. He too was scientist, poet, physician, and philosopher. He became the doctor and vizier of the Caliph Abu Yaqub Yusuf at Marrakesh, the Almohad capital in Morocco. He managed to spend most of his waking hours in the royal library and found time to write, among more technical works, the most remarkable philosophical romance in medieval literature. It took its title from Ibn Sina, and through Ockley's English translation in 1708, may have suggested Robinson Crusoe to Defoe. Hayy ibn Yaqzan, which translates as Alive, son of Vigilant, who gives his name to the tale, was cast in infancy upon an uninhabited island. Nursed by a she-goat, he grew in intelligence and skill, made his shoes and clothes from animal skins, studied the stars, dissected animals alive or dead, and arrived at the highest degree of knowledge in this kind which the most learned naturalists ever attained. He passed from science to philosophy and theology, demonstrated to himself the existence of an all-powerful creator, practiced asceticism, forswore meat, and achieved an ecstatic union with the active intellect. Hayy was now 49 and ripe for an audience. Fortunately, a mystic named Asal now had himself deposited on the island, seeking solitude. He met Hayy, who for the first time discovered the existence of mankind. Asal taught him language, and rejoiced to find that Hayy had arrived unaided at a knowledge of God. He confessed to Hayy the coarseness of the popular religion in the land from which he, Asal, had come, and mourned that a modicum of morality had been achieved only by promises of heaven and threats of hell. Hayy resolved to go and convert this benighted people to a higher and more philosophical religion. Arrived, he preached his pantheism in the marketplace. The populace ignored him or did not understand him. Hayy concluded that Muhammad was right, that the people can be disciplined to social order only by religion of myth, miracle, ceremony, and supernatural punishments and rewards. He apologized for his intrusion, returned to his island, and lived there with Asal in daily companionship with placid animals and the active intellect, and thus they continued serving God until they died. It was with a rare absence of jealousy that Ibn Tufail, about 1153, introduced to the favor of Abu Yaqub Yusuf, a young lawyer and physician, known to Islam as Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Rushd, and to medieval Europe as Averroes, who lived from 1126 to 1198, the most influential figure in Islamic philosophy. His grandfather and his father had in turn been Chief Justice of Cordova, and had lavished on him all the education that the old capital could provide. One of his pupils has transmitted what purports to be Averroes' own account of his first interview with the emir. When I was presented to the Prince of Believers, I found him alone with Ibn Tufail, who sounded my praises to him with compliments that I did not deserve. The emir opened the conversation by asking, what opinion did the philosophers hold about the heavens? Are they eternal, or did they have a beginning? I was overcome with terror and confusion, and sought some pretext for not answering. But the emir, perceiving my trouble, turned to Ibn Tufail and began to discourse with him on the question, recalling the opinions of Plato and Aristotle and other philosophers, and the objections that had been made to them by Moslem theologians, all with such fullness of memory as I should not have expected even of professional philosophers. The emir put me at my ease and tested my knowledge. When I had retired, he sent me a sum of money, a riding horse, and a costly robe of honor. In 1169, Averroes was appointed Chief Justice of Seville. In 1172, of Cordova. 10 years later, Abu Yaqub called him to Marrakesh to serve as court physician, and he continued in this capacity when, in 1184, Yaqub was succeeded by Yaqub al-Mansur. In 1194, he was banished to Lucena, near Cordova, to satisfy public resentment of his heresies. He was forgiven and recalled in 1198, but died in that year. His tomb may still be seen at Marrakesh. His work in medicine has almost been forgotten in his fame as a philosopher. He was, however, one of the greatest physicians of his time, the first to explain the function of the retina, and to recognize that an attack of smallpox confers subsequent immunity. His Encyclopedia of Medicine, Kitab al-Kulliyat fil Tib, translated into Latin, was widely used as a text in Christian universities. Meanwhile, the Emir Abu Yaqub had expressed the wish that someone would write a clear exposition of Aristotle, and Ibn Tufayl recommended the task to Averroes. The suggestion was welcomed, for Averroes had already concluded that all philosophy was contained in the Stagirite, who merely needed interpretation to be made contemporary with any age. He resolved to prepare for each major work of Aristotle first a summary, then a brief commentary, then a detailed commentary for advanced students, a mode of progressively complex exposition habitual in Moslem universities. Unfortunately, he knew no Greek and had to rely on Arabic translations of Syriac translations of Aristotle. Nevertheless, his patience, perspicuity, and keen analysis won him throughout Europe the name of the commentator, and placed him at once near the head of Moslem philosophy, second only to the great Avicenna himself. To these writings he added several works of his own on logic, physics, psychology, metaphysics, theology, law, astronomy, and grammar, and a reply to Al-Ghazali's Destruction of Philosophy under the title of Destruction of the Destruction, Tahafut al-Tahafut. He argued, as Francis Bacon would, that though a little philosophy might incline a man to atheism, unhindered study would lead to a better understanding between religion and philosophy. For though the philosopher cannot accept in their literal sense the dogmas of the Koran, the Bible, and other revealed books, he perceives their necessity in developing a wholesome piety and morality among the people, who are so harassed with economic importunities that they find no time for more than incidental, superficial, and dangerous thinking on first and last things. Hence the mature philosopher will neither utter nor encourage any word against the established faith. In return, the philosopher should be left free to seek the truth, but he should confine his discussions within the circle and comprehension of the educated, and make no propaganda among the populace. Symbolically interpreted, the doctrines of religion can be harmonized with the findings of science and philosophy. Such interpretation of sacred texts through symbol and allegory has been practiced even by divines for centuries. Averroes does not explicitly teach, he merely implies, the doctrine imputed to him by Christian critics, that a proposition may be true in philosophy, among the educated, and false or harmful in religion and morals. Hence the opinions of Averroes must be sought not in the minor treatises which he composed for a general audience, but in his more recondite commentaries on Aristotle. He defines philosophy as an inquiry into the meaning of existence with a view to the improvement of man. The world is eternal. The movements of the heavens never began and will never end. Creation is a myth. The partisans of creation argue that the agent, or God, produces a new being without needing for its production any pre-existing material. It is such imagining that has led the theologians of the three religions existing in our day to say that something can issue from nothing. Motion is eternal and continuous. All motion has its cause in a preceding motion. Without motion there is no time. We cannot conceive of motion having either a beginning or an end. Nonetheless, God is the creator of the world in the sense that it exists at any moment only through his sustaining power, and undergoes, so to speak, continuous creation through the divine energy. God is the order, force, and mind of the universe. From this supreme order and intelligence there emanates an order and intelligence in the planets and the stars. From the intelligence in the lowest of the celestial circles, that of the moon, comes the active or effective intellect which enters into the body and mind of individual men. The human mind is composed of two elements. One is the passive or material intellect, a capacity and possibility of thought forming a part of the body and dying with it. The other is the active intellect, a divine influx which activates the passive intellect into actual thought. This active intellect has no individuality. It is the same in all men, and it alone is immortal. Averroes compares the operation of the active intellect upon the individual or passive intellect with the influence of the sun, whose light makes many objects luminous, but remains everywhere and permanently one. And as fire reaches out to a combustible body, so the individual intellect aspires to be united with the active intellect. In this union, the human mind becomes like unto God, for it holds all the universe potentially in the grasp of its thought. Indeed, the world and its contents have no existence for us, and no meaning except through the mind that apprehends them. Only the perception of truth through reason can lead the mind to that union with God which the Sufis think to reach by ascetic discipline or intoxicating dance. Averroes has no use for mysticism. His notion of paradise is the quiet and kindly wisdom of the sage. This was Aristotle's conclusion, too, and of course the theory of the active and passive intellect, nous poietikos and nous pathetikos, goes back to Aristotle's De Anima, as interpreted by Alexander of Aphrodisias and Themistius of Alexandria, transformed into the emanation theory of the Neoplatonists and transmitted in philosophic dynasty through Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Ibn Bajjah. Here at the end, as in its beginning, Arabic philosophy was Aristotle Neoplatonized. But whereas in most Muslim and Christian philosophers Aristotle's doctrines were retailored to meet the needs of theology, in Averroes Mohammedan dogmas were reduced to a minimum to reconcile them with Aristotle. Hence Averroes had more influence in Christendom than in Islam. His Muslim contemporaries persecuted him, Muslim posterity forgot him, and allowed most of his works to be lost in their Arabic form. Jews preserved many of them in Hebrew translation, and Maimonides followed in Averroes' steps in seeking to reconcile religion and philosophy. In Christendom, the commentaries, translated into Latin from the Hebrew, fed the heresies of Siget de Brabant and the rationalism of the school of Padua, and threatened the foundations of Christian belief. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote his Summae to stem this Averroistic tide, but he followed Averroes in the method of his commentaries, in divers interpretations of Aristotle, in choosing matter as the principle of individuation, in the symbolical explanation of anthropomorphic scriptural texts, in admitting the possible eternity of the world, in rejecting mysticism as a sufficient basis for theology, and in recognizing that some dogmas of religion are beyond reason and can be accepted by faith alone. Roger Bacon ranked Averroes next to Aristotle and Avicenna, and added, with characteristic exaggeration, the philosophy of Averroes today, speaking circa 1270, obtains the unanimous suffrage of wise men. In 1150, the Caliph Mustanjid at Baghdad ordered burned all the philosophical works of Avicenna and the Brethren of Sincerity. In 1194, the Emir Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur, then at Seville, ordered the burning of all works by Averroes except a few on natural science. He forbade his subjects to study philosophy, and urged them to throw into a fire all books of philosophy wherever found. These instructions were eagerly carried out by the people, who resented attacks upon a faith that for the most of them was the dearest solace of their harassed lives. About this time, Ibn Habib was put to death for studying philosophy. After 1200, Islam shunned speculative thought. As political power declined in the Moslem world, it sought more and more the aid of the theologians and lawyers of orthodoxy. That aid was given, but in return for the suppression of independent thought. Even so, the aid did not suffice to save the state. In Spain, the Christians advanced from city to city, until only Granada remained Moslem. In the east, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem, and in 1258 the Mongols took and destroyed Baghdad. 9. The Coming of the Mongols, 1219 to 1258. Once again, history illustrated the truism that civilized comfort attracts barbarian conquest. The Seljuks had brought new strength to Eastern Islam, but they too had succumbed to ease and had allowed the empire of Malik Shah to break down into autonomous kingdoms, culturally brilliant and militarily weak. Religious fanaticism and racial antipathies divided the people into bitter sects and frustrated any united defense against the Crusades. Meanwhile, on the plains and deserts of northwestern Asia, the Mongols thrived on hardships and primitive fertility. They lived in tents or the open air, followed their herds to fresh pastures, clothed themselves in ox hides, and studied with relish the arts of war. These new Huns, like their kin of 8 centuries back, were experts with dagger and sword, and arrows aimed from their flying steeds. If we may believe the Christian missionary Giovanni de Piano Carpini, they eat anything edible, even lice, and they had as little repugnance to feeding on rats, cats, dogs, and human blood as our most cultured contemporaries to eating eels and snails. Genghis Khan, that is, the Great King, 1167 to 1227, disciplined them with severe laws into an irresistible force, and led them to the conquest of Central Asia from the Volga to the Chinese Wall. During the absence of Genghis Khan from his capital at Karakorum, a Mongol chieftain rebelled against him and formed a league with Ala al-Din Muhammad, the Shah of the independent state of Khwarizm. Genghis suppressed the rebellion and sent the Shah an offer of peace. The offer was accepted, but shortly thereafter 2 Mongol merchants in Transoxiana were executed as spies by Muhammad's governor Otrar. Genghis demanded the extradition of the governor. Muhammad refused, beheaded the chief of the Mongol embassy, and sent its other members back without their beards. Genghis declared war, and the Mongol invasion of Islam began in 1219. An army under the Khan's son Juji defeated Muhammad's 400,000 troops at Jand. The Shah fled to Samarkand, leaving 160,000 of his men dead on the field. Another army under Genghis's son Jagatai captured and sacked Otrar. A third army under Genghis himself burned Bokhara to the ground, raped thousands of women, and massacred 30,000 men. Samarkand and Balkh surrendered at his coming, but suffered pillage and wholesale slaughter. A full century later, Ibn Battuta described these cities as still largely in ruins. Genghis's son Tuli led 70,000 men through Khorasan, ravaging every town on their march. The Mongols placed captives in their van and gave them a choice between fighting their fellow men in front or being cut down from behind. Merv was captured by treachery and was burned to the ground. Its libraries, the glory of Islam, were consumed in the conflagration. Its inhabitants were allowed to march out through the gates with their treasures, only to be massacred and robbed in detail. This slaughter, the Moslem historians aver, occupied 13 days and took 1,300,000 lives. Nishapur resisted long and bravely, but succumbed in 1221. Every man, woman, and child there was killed, except 400 artisan artists who were sent to Mongolia, and the heads of the slain were piled up in a ghastly pyramid. The lovely city of Rai, with its 3,000 mosques and its famous pottery kilns, was laid in ruins, and, the Moslem historian tells us, its entire population was put to death. Muhammad's son Jalaluddin collected a new army of Turks, gave Genghis battle on the Indus, was defeated, and fled to Delhi. Herat, having rebelled against its Mongol governor, was punished with the slaughter of 60,000 inhabitants. This ferocity was part of the military science of the Mongols. It sought to strike a paralyzing terror into the hearts of later opponents and to leave no possibility of revolt among the defeated. The policy succeeded. Genghis now returned to Mongolia, enjoyed his 500 wives and concubines, and died in bed. His son and successor, Ogatai, sent a horde of 300,000 men to capture Jalaluddin, who had formed another army at Diyarbakir. Jalal was defeated and killed, and the unhindered Mongols ravaged Azerbaijan, northern Mesopotamia, Georgia, and Armenia, this in 1234. Hearing that a rebellion led by the Assassins had broken out in Iran, Hulagu, a grandson of Genghis, led a Mongol army through Samarkand and Balkh, destroyed the assassin stronghold at Alamut, and turned toward Baghdad. Al-Mustasim Billah, last of the Abbasid caliphs of the East, was a learned scholar, a meticulous calligrapher, a man of exemplary gentleness, devoted to religion, books, and charity. This was an enemy to Hulagu's taste. The Mongol accused the caliph of sheltering rebels and of withholding promised aid against the assassins. As penalty, he demanded the submission of the caliph to the Great Khan and the complete demilitarization of Baghdad. Al-Mustasim returned a boastful refusal. After a month of siege, Al-Mustasim sent Hulagu presents and an offer of surrender. Lured by a promise of clemency, he and his 2 sons gave themselves up to the Mongol. On February 13, 1258, Hulagu and his troops entered Baghdad and began 40 days of pillage and massacre. 800,000 of the inhabitants, we are told, were killed. Thousands of scholars, scientists, and poets fell in the indiscriminate slaughter. Libraries and treasures accumulated through centuries were in a week plundered or destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of volumes were consumed. Finally, the caliph and his family, after being forced to reveal the hiding place of their secret wealth, were put to death. So ended the Abbasid Caliphate in Asia. Hulagu now returned to Mongolia. His army remained behind, and under other generals it advanced to the conquest of Syria. At Ain Jalut it met an Egyptian army under the Mamluk leaders Qutuz and Baibars, and was destroyed in 1260. Everywhere in Islam and Europe men of all faiths rejoiced. The spell of fear was broken. In 1303 a decisive battle near Damascus ended the Mongol threat and saved Syria for the Mamluks, perhaps Europe for Christianity. Never in history had a civilization suffered so suddenly, so devastating a blow. The barbarian conquest of Rome had been spread over 2 centuries. Between each blow and the next, some recovery was possible, and the German conquerors respected, some tried to preserve, the dying empire which they helped to destroy. But the Mongols came and went within 40 years. They came not to conquer and stay, but to kill, pillage, and carry their spoils to Mongolia. When their bloody tide ebbed, it left behind a fatally disrupted economy, canals broken or choked, schools and libraries in ashes, governments too poor, divided, and weak to govern, and a population cut in half and shattered in soul. Epicurean indulgence, physical and mental exhaustion, military incompetence and cowardice, religious sectarianism and obscurantism, political corruption and anarchy, all culminating in a piecemeal collapse before external attack. This, and no change of climate, turned Western Asia from world leadership to destitution, from 100 teeming and cultured cities in Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, the Caucasus, and Transoxiana, into the poverty, disease, and stagnation of modern times. 10. Islam and Christendom. The rise and decline of Islamic civilization is one of the major phenomena of history. For 5 centuries, from 700 to 1200, Islam led the world in power, order, and extent of government, in refinement of manners, in standards of living, in humane legislation and religious toleration, in literature, scholarship, science, medicine, and philosophy. In architecture it yielded the palm in the 12th century to the cathedrals of Europe, and Gothic sculpture found no rival in inhibited Islam. Moslem art exhausted itself in decoration and suffered from narrowness of range and monotony of style, but within its self-imposed limits it has never been surpassed. In Islam, art and culture were more widely shared than in medieval Christendom. Kings were calligraphers, and merchants, like physicians, might be philosophers. In sexual morality during these centuries, Christendom probably excelled Islam, though there was not much to choose. Christian monogamy, however evaded in practice, kept the sexual impulse within bounds and slowly raised the status of woman, while Islam darkened the face of woman with purdah and the veil. The Church succeeded in limiting divorce, and homosexual diversions seem never to have attained, even in Renaissance Italy, the spread and freedom allowed them not in Mohammedan law, but in Moslem life. The Moslems seem to have been better gentlemen than their Christian peers. They kept their word more frequently, showed more mercy to the defeated, and were seldom guilty of such brutality as marked the Christian capture of Jerusalem in 1099. Christian law continued to use ordeal by battle, water, or fire, while Moslem law was developing an advanced jurisprudence and an enlightened judiciary. The Mohammedan religion, less original than the Hebrew, less embracing in eclecticism than the Christian, kept its creed and ritual simpler and purer, less dramatic and colorful than the Christian, and made less concession to the natural polytheism of mankind. It resembled Protestantism in scorning the aid and play that Mediterranean religion offered to the imagination and the senses. But it bowed to popular sensualism in its picture of paradise. It kept itself almost free from sacerdotalism, but fell into a narrow and dulling orthodoxy just when Christianity was entering into the most exuberant period of Catholic philosophy. The influence of Christendom on Islam was almost limited to religion and war. Probably from Christian exemplars came Mohammedan mysticism, monasticism, and the worship of the saints. The figure and story of Jesus touched the Moslem soul and appeared sympathetically in Moslem poetry and art. The influence of Islam upon Christendom was varied and immense. From Islam, Christian Europe received foods, drinks, drugs, medicaments, armor, heraldry, art motives and tastes, industrial and commercial articles and techniques, maritime codes and ways, and often the words for these things: orange, lemon, sugar, syrup, sherbet, julep, elixir, jar, azure, arabesque, mattress, sofa, muslin, satin, fustian, bazaar, caravan, check, tariff, traffic, Duan, magazine, risk, sloop, barge, cable, admiral. The game of chess came to Europe from India via Islam and picked up Persian terms on the way. Checkmate is from the Persian shamat, the king is dead. Some of our musical instruments bear in their names evidence of their Semitic origin: lute, rebec, guitar, tambourine. The poetry and music of the troubadours came from Moslem Spain into Provence and from Moslem Sicily into Italy, and Arabic descriptions of trips to heaven and hell may have shared in forming the Divine Comedy. Hindu fables and numerals entered Europe in Arabic dress or form. Moslem science preserved and developed Greek mathematics, physics, chemistry, astronomy, and medicine, and transmitted this Greek heritage, considerably enriched, to Europe. And Arabic scientific terms, algebra, zero, cipher, azimuth, alembic, zenith, almanac, still lie embedded in European speech. Moslem medicine led the world for half a millennium. Moslem philosophy preserved and corrupted Aristotle for Christian Europe. Avicenna and Averroes were lights from the East for the schoolmen, who cited them as next to the Greeks in authority. The ribbed vault is older in Islam than in Europe, though we cannot trace the route by which it came into Gothic art. Christian spire and belfry owe much to the minaret, and perhaps Gothic window tracery took a lead from the cusped arcading of the Giralda Tower. The rejuvenation of ceramic art in Italy and France has been attributed to the importation of Moslem potters in the 12th century and to the visits of Italian potters to Moslem Spain. Venetian workers in metal and glass, Italian bookbinders, Spanish armorers learned their techniques from Moslem artisans. And almost everywhere in Europe, weavers looked to Islam for models and designs. Even gardens received a Persian influence. We shall see later by what avenues these influences came, through commerce and the Crusades, through 1,000 translations from Arabic into Latin, through the visits of scholars like Gerbert, Michael Scott, and Adelard of Bath to Moslem Spain, through the sending of Christian youths by their Spanish parents to Moslem courts to receive a knightly education, for the Moslem aristocrats were accounted knights and gentlemen, albeit Moors, through the daily contact of Christians with Moslems in Syria, Egypt, Sicily, and Spain. Every advance of the Christians in Spain admitted a wave of Islamic literature, science, philosophy, and art into Christendom. So the capture of Toledo in 1085 immensely furthered Christian knowledge of astronomy and kept alive the doctrine of the sphericity of the earth. Behind this borrowing smoldered an undying hate. Nothing save bread is so precious to mankind as its religious beliefs, for man lives not by bread alone, but also by the faith that lets him hope. Therefore his deepest hatred greets those who challenge his sustenance or his creed. For 3 centuries Christianity saw Islam advance, saw it capture and absorb one Christian land and people after another, felt its constricting hand upon Christian trade, and heard it call Christians infidels. At last the potential conflict became actual. The rival civilizations clashed in the Crusades, and the best of the East or West slew the best of the West or East. Back of all medieval history lay this mutual hostility, with a third faith, the Jewish, caught between the main combatants and cut by both swords. The West lost the Crusades, but won the War of Creeds. Every Christian warrior was expelled from the Holy Land of Judaism and Christianity, but Islam, bled by its tardy victory and ravaged by Mongols, fell in turn into a dark age of obscurantism and poverty, while the beaten West, matured by its effort and forgetting its defeat, learned avidly from its enemy, lifted cathedrals into the sky, wandered out on the high seas of reason, transformed its crude new languages into Dante, Chaucer, and Villon, and moved with high spirit into the Renaissance. The general reader will marvel at the length of this survey of Islamic civilization, and the scholar will mourn its inadequate brevity. Only at the peaks of history has a society produced in an equal period so many illustrious men in government, education, literature, philology, geography, history, mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, philosophy, and medicine as Islam in the 4 centuries between Harun al-Rashid and Averroes. Part of this brilliant activity fed on Greek leavings, but much of it, above all in statesmanship, poetry, and art, was original and invaluable. In one sense, this zenith of Islam was a recovery of the Near East from Greek domination. It reached back not only to Sasanian and Achaemenid Persia, but to the Judea of Solomon, the Assyria of Ashurbanipal, the Babylonia of Hammurabi, the Akkad of Sargon, and the Sumeria of unknown kings. So the continuity of history reasserts itself. Despite earthquakes, epidemics, famines, eruptive migrations, and catastrophic wars, the essential processes of civilization are not lost. Some younger culture takes them up, snatches them from the conflagration, carries them on imitatively, then creatively, until fresh youth and spirit can enter the race. As men are members of one another, and generations are moments in a family line, so civilizations are units in a larger whole whose name is history. They are stages in the life of man. Civilization is polygenetic. It is the cooperative product of many peoples, ranks, and faiths, and no one who studies its history can be a bigot of race or creed. Therefore the scholar, though he belongs to his country through affectionate kinship, feels himself also a citizen of that country of the mind which knows no hatreds and no frontiers. He hardly deserves his name if he carries into his study political prejudices or racial discriminations or religious animosities, and he accords his grateful homage to any people that has borne the torch and enriched his heritage. This concludes the reading of The Age of Faith, Part 1, by Will Durant. Part 2 continues the story and is available through the Books on Tape service. This book was read by Alexander Adams. Will you please wind or rewind the tape as appropriate so the book will be in order for the next person to enjoy? Thank you.